This is Matthew Kratter's Bitcoin University. Today I want to talk about Bitcoin going to $10 million per coin. And this video is a follow-up on yesterday's video, which was discussing the current attack that the ECB, the European Central Bank, is making on Bitcoin, as well as this paper called The Distributional Consequences of Bitcoin. The context, the overall economic and social context for this paper is that the EU itself is in an accelerating state of decline due to decades of poor policy decisions. That includes a very high tax regime, ridiculous regulatory burden for individuals and for businesses, absolutely terrible energy policy, an unfunded pension crisis, a sovereign debt crisis, among other things. Now, there are only two paths out of this mess. There's austerity, and then there is inflating your way out of the debt. The problem with austerity and belt tightening is they never work to solve political problems because there really is never the political will for them. And if you're a politician who tries austerity, in other words, cutting government spending, firing government workers, shrinking the impact of the government on the economy, if you're a politician who tries to do this and sort of cut the budget deficits, you're going to be voted out the next cycle, and then your successor will end up going the inflationary route instead. So we know that the EU will choose inflation. We know because of that that the ECB is getting ready to rev up the money printers as we speak. And they clearly understand that the result of this will be a spectacular rise in Bitcoin's price, what the authors of this paper glumly call a quote-unquote Bitcoin positive scenario, though they don't sound very positive about it. It turns out that the central bankers are even more bullish on Bitcoin than most Bitcoiners. So if we take a look inside this paper, we can see this prediction. While the current market value of a Bitcoin is in the range of $50,000 to $60,000 US, it could be argued that any price for Bitcoin is equally plausible, including $10 million per coin or more. Now, this is the central thesis of this paper that we're going to be talking about today. If the price of Bitcoin rises for good, in other words, if the price of Bitcoin goes up and stays up, if the price of Bitcoin rises for good, the existence of Bitcoin impoverishes both non-holders and latecomers. What a ridiculous statement that we're going to be talking about. While previous discussions on the redistributive effects of Bitcoin assumed that badly timed trading was a necessary condition for losses, this paper shows that neither poor timing of trades nor holding Bitcoin at all are necessary for impoverishment under a Bitcoin positive scenario. So this is really the paper's central argument, that early holders of Bitcoin are impoverishing people who bought later. Now, how many years back does this extend? Am I personally partially responsible for impoverishing other people because I first bought five-figure Bitcoin in late 2019 and early 2020? For example, I bought some Bitcoin for around $15,000 and then rode it all the way up to $69,000 and then rode it all the way back down to $15,000, $16,000 and now back up to $67,000 or wherever we are now. I also bought a lot of Bitcoin in the 60,000s and was underwater on it for years and have only recently gotten back in the money on it. Now, was that stealing from people, or did the stealing begin the moment that my position finally got back in the money? If you're enjoying this video so far, I just ask you to help to support this channel's mission. Hit the subscribe button. That really does help with the YouTube algorithm and helps to support this channel. Leave a like, leave a comment, question, suggestion for a future video or response to this video in the comment section below. Share this video with a friend or family member. You can also leave a tip by clicking the thanks button, and you can also join to get a couple extra free videos if you click the join button. So here's the real question that I'm asking the ECB. Did I hurt anyone by buying Bitcoin? Did I inflict violence on anyone by buying Bitcoin? What actually happened was that many of my old friends, old colleagues, and extended family laughed at me and told me that I was obsessed with garbage and had lost my mind. So if anything, the violence and the abuse really went the other direction. When I bought Bitcoin, did I steal from anyone? To buy Bitcoin, I used fiat money that I'd earned honestly and paid a ton of taxes on and had already suffered a lot of loss of purchasing power, in other words, monetary debasement on. Am I a bad person because I shielded my family from central bank money printing that was being used to help my government fund its deficit spending and buy bombs to drop on women and children all around the world? Was this the bad thing that I did? Am I a bad person because I want to opt out of a system that supports the military-industrial complex and sex trafficking for our so-called elites? If I bought shares of BlackRock or Goldman Sachs or other big banks at the same time and made money on them, Was I thereby impoverishing those who didn't own any BlackRock or Goldman Sachs shares for the past 4 years? And to be very clear, I did not own either of these, nor would I want to. Or does this critique from the ECB apply only to those assets that bankers don't like? If I make money on banking stocks, the central bankers don't get mad about that. But if my purchasing power increases by holding Bitcoin, that seems to be the thing that they don't like. For example, is Bill Gates a bad person because he owned Microsoft shares before anyone else? If not, why not? Here's the thing. When a new technology comes along, those who jump on the bandwagon earlier than everyone else almost always benefit economically more than people who don't. People like Bill Gates, Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, Peter Thiel, and then going back to another generation, Henry Ford, J.D. Rockefeller, etc. I guess that's only a bad thing if you're a Marxist or a central banker who doesn't create anything of value for the world, because these are all people, these were all pioneers in their respective industries. They made a lot of money as a result. The question is the ECB against basic entrepreneurship and investment like this as well? The bankers are the ones who are actually responsible for impoverishing people, because they're the ones who've been telling people for the past 15 years that Bitcoin is a bubble, it's a scam, it's a Ponzi, it uses too much energy. They've been doing this for a very long time, while at the same time printing ungodly amounts of fiat that dilutes the savings of hardworking people everywhere. Now, it's also important to remember who's speaking here. I am not a Bitcoin OG. I had a chance to buy 10,000 Bitcoin in 2011 for about $10,000. In other words, $1 per Bitcoin. But I was too lazy to investigate, and I told my friend that it probably wouldn't change my net worth that much. That position is obviously worth about $670 million today, so it would have moved the dial on my net worth a tremendous amount. But I'm not blaming anyone else for this. It was my own TradFi arrogance and laziness that made me miss out. I had multiple chances to buy and to research Bitcoin from 2011 to 2019, and I still didn't do it. So it was almost a decade that I knew about it, and yet I didn't buy any. Is that someone else's fault? No, I think it's my fault. And here's the thing. You didn't even need to have any money back in 2011 to get a lot of Bitcoin. You just had to have some intellectual curiosity and do some research. For example, you could have gotten 5 Bitcoin for free from faucets like this. And I believe the original Gavin Andresen faucet was giving out 15 Bitcoin. All you had to do was enter a CAPTCHA or solve a CAPTCHA, and then you would get 5 to 50 Bitcoin sent to you. And over the years, 19,700 were sent by Gavin Andresen from this particular faucet. So again, you didn't even need to have any money to get 5 Bitcoin, which is worth a tremendous amount of money now. It's the central bankers and the fiat politicians who've been telling us for years that Bitcoin is going to zero. They've been very, very wrong, and all of their arguments have fallen flat, and all the evidence is against them now, especially the price performance of Bitcoin over the past 15 years. They were wrong. So now, is it our fault for holding on for dear life, for hodling? The volatility has been incredibly painful at times, even just since 2020, and I wasn't really hodling before late 2019, early 2020. I put on a brave face for this channel at times, but there were days in late 2022 when I felt physically ill for weeks from my collapsing Bitcoin investment because I'd gone all in. There's also the hypocrisy of it all. You want to talk about wealth redistribution. No one plays the game of wealth redistribution more than central bankers and politicians who get to print up or steal money through taxation, while the rest of us have to work for it. So when you talk about wealth redistribution, as these authors want to, it's really the bankers and the fiat politicians who are to blame for this. I think Pierre Rochard sums it up nicely here. Message for fiat bros. Please don't lecture us about Bitcoin's inequality after you printed trillions of euros and trillions of dollars to bail out your bankers and politicians. That pretty much sums it up. Here's another thing as well that's really important to remember. Don't assume that just because someone has been in Bitcoin for a long time that they're rich. Many Bitcoin OGs spent or lost their coins, and not just in fake, quote-unquote, boating accidents. As Rahim here points out, as one of the few economists who was also early in Bitcoin, I can dispute some of the opinions presented as facts in this report and thread talking about how rich Bitcoin OGs got. I've experienced a continuous quote-unquote redistribution of early Bitcoiners to later Bitcoiners. In other words, the Bitcoin flowing from these early people to later people like you and me. Almost all who went in early for the money have sold soon after. The others lost most of their Bitcoin due to errors, experiments, failed ventures, listening to quote-unquote experts, social pressures. Building on the errors, learnings, and investments of early Bitcoiners, it has become easier and easier to have Bitcoin exposure. 10 years ago, Jürgen Schaff, who's one of the authors of this paper, ignored it. Some years ago, he ridiculed it, predicting loss of value. Now he fights it. That pretty much sums it up. And if you want to go down this rabbit hole a bit, I have an old video about how I talk about why many Bitcoin OGs are poor. So here's the conclusion from this ECB paper. Quote, current non-holders of Bitcoin should realize that they have compelling reasons to oppose Bitcoin and advocate for legislation against it, aiming to prevent Bitcoin prices from rising or to see Bitcoin disappear altogether. I got news for you bankers. You keep printing. There's nothing you can do to stop Bitcoin's price. And there's nothing you can do to stop Bitcoin's price either. But here he is. Here the authors are advocating for legislation against Bitcoin. Latecomers, quote, latecomers and non-holders and their political representatives should emphasize that the idea of Bitcoin as an investment relies on redistribution at their expense. Such a ridiculous statement. But in other words, expect bankers and politicians, especially in the EU, to try to use no-coiner envy. This is a basic political envy play. To try to use no-coiner envy to mobilize political support for heavily taxing and stealing from Bitcoiners. And also expect bankers and politicians to blame Bitcoiners for the very inflation that they themselves caused through money printing and out-of-control deficit spending. And this is something I predicted approximately a year ago, that there would be a future scenario where governments and central bankers would attempt to blame Bitcoiners for the inflation and currency devaluation that was actually caused by the central banks monetizing government deficit spending. Here's the conclusion. Central bankers, like the authors of this paper, preside over what's called fiat money, money that's just generated out of nothing. Fiat money is controlled by a small group of insiders and used to pick the pockets of hardworking people all over the world through inflation. So we're taxed, but then there's this stealth tax called inflation that everyone's subject to. Fiat money is imposed on people under threat of violence and imprisonment. For example, if I don't use US dollars to pay my US taxes, I end up in a metal cage, and I never opted into this system. I was never given a choice. By contrast, Bitcoin is a voluntary system. Unlike fiat, Bitcoin has never been forced on anyone. Bitcoin is open to everyone, regardless of race, tribe, religion, skin color, sexual orientation, political affiliation, etc. And when you hear this, you should ask yourself, how many times have bankers and fiat politicians discriminated against people all over the world? Bitcoin never discriminates against anyone because Bitcoin is fair, neutral money for the world's 8 billion people, most of whom suffer under currency regimes that are far worse than the US dollar or the euro. These currency regimes, much weaker currencies that steal their economic energy, the economic energy of the people, and ensure that these people can never get ahead. So if you don't opt into the Bitcoin system, that's your decision. If the ECB was actually so concerned about this problem, then the ECB or the various EU constituents and governments should accumulate a few billion euros worth of Bitcoin and hold it for the people of Europe. And paying 62,000 euros per Bitcoin or wherever it is now, still an amazing deal if Bitcoin is headed to 10 million per coin, as the ECB itself believes is possible. Or maybe it's just this. Maybe European bankers and politicians don't actually care about the people that they're supposed to be looking out for, and writing papers like this is really just concern trolling, and they're just worried about their own fiat positions. Maybe they're just mad because they see the writing on the wall and finally are beginning to realize that the jig is almost up for them and their corrupt cronies. We're now definitely entering the stage where they fight us. It's going to get really ugly first, but then we're going to win. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to hit the subscribe and like buttons. Hit the notification bell if you want to be notified when I publish my next video. And let me know your questions and comments in the comment section below. Thanks a lot for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.